Hello again. I'm gonna get right to this. The first question is give a summary of the videos, including the speakers. Starting with the first set, we've got Reverend Dr. Soon Chan Ra. He's a Milton B. Ingebretson Associate Professor of Church Growth and Evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. He's also the author of The Next Evangelicalism, Freeing the Church from Western Cultural Captivity, and he's the author of Many Colors, Cultural Intelligence for a Changing Church. One of the biggest things that I got from his videos is his talk about lament. If I'm being honest, I didn't really know what that meant for a while. I looked it up at our last ELD, then forgot what it meant. Our last weekend, then forgot what it meant, and looked it up again today and saw that it is a passionate expression of grief and sorrow. I thought that was interesting. When I sit back and think of it, I'm like, wow, that isn't something for me personally, it's not something I experienced a lot of until I went to black churches. Until I went to black churches. So that is something he really drove home for me. I remember he was talking about how he did a study on like the amount of songs that talk about lament or are lament theme songs, and there weren't many. So that's his video. Then we have Dr. Christina Cleveland. She's a social psychologist, public theologian, author, and activist. She's the founder of the Center for Justice and Renewal. In her videos, I learned a lot about the process of learning about yourself, learning about your racial identity, less your racial identity. She talked about some instances where somebody discovered their racial identity, or became more aware of just a lot of things that had to do with their racial identity. She also talked a lot about white people and their discovery of racism, learning what that is and how like they'll learn about it. Like at first they're at this point where they're like, oh yeah, I'm living life is good, I'm not doing anything bad. Then they go through these different stages where they're learning. They're like, oh snap, dang. And then they're at the stage where like, oh my goodness, I'm terrible. Then they're at the stage where like, yeah, I know this. Now I'm around all these other white people. Y'all suck. Then they're at the stage where they're like, okay, I'm white. I may not like it, but here I am. What can I do positively? She also talked about how black people go through that same kind of process. She mentioned a student that was at this Christian university who was adopted by a white family and was one of the few black people at his campus. He was like the star athlete on the soccer team. Then he took her class and like he had this moment where like, oh shoot, I'm black. I didn't know. And from there, he starts to learn all these things and goes through that same process like, oh, whoa, I'm black. But it's kind of different for him because for white people, like, yeah, I'm white, there's this thing that's going on. For a black person who hasn't been around black people much, maybe even ever, it's like, oh, shoot, I'm black. And it's like instantly in this environment where it's like, these are a bunch of white people who've been doing all this stuff that I didn't realize until now I hate you. So she just talked a lot about those processes. She also brought up this word, or a few things, ontological expansiveness. My understanding of it was this like kind of like going into a room and like being there, like, yo, I'm here, I'm taking up space. So that was an interesting thing that she went into. The last was Dr. Chris Dula, who passed January 2019. He was a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychology at East Tennessee State University with adjunct appointment in the Quillen College of Medicine's Department of Family Medicine. He taught, one of the biggest things I took away from his videos, he talked about how people have, like, there's this way that people are viewed and understood, and it's based on, like, just things we know about them. But he pointed out how even though you feel you know a person, or even when I think that person feels like I am this person, or he is this type of person. He was pointing out how, like, even though you may believe somebody is this type of person, that can change when they get into, like, this crazy scenario where it's like, oh shoot, things are different, things are, like, heightened, and they act in such a different way. I do not recall the word. It's on the tip of my tongue. But he was talking about that, how, like, somebody can be one way, they can be viewed one way, but all that can change based on circumstances that are going on. The next question: what did you learn about lament, social psychology, and race? The biggest thing I learned about lament, was what it meant. But I also, I was like, wow, as he was saying that it's not a very common thing in church, I was like, I can't remember often times it was brought up. He even asked, he was like, raise your hand if you've heard a sermon on, went through Lamentations. I didn't raise my hand because I haven't. I forgot it was a book in the Bible, but only like 2 people raised their hand. He was like, exactly, that's my point. People avoid Lamentations. So for me, the biggest thing I learned from that is what it is, and the fact that it's not touched on probably as much as it should be. For me, that's something I want to look into now and understand better. For social psychology, the biggest thing was what I just explained, is how people can be different in certain situations. Like for me, like, I'm seen as a quiet person, doesn't say much, serious. That's not at all who I am, by the way. It just looks like that. But like when, like, a high stress situation comes up, or like if something needs to get done, if I'm competing, oh my goodness, I am loud. I don't close my mouth. Or if there's something that really needs to get done, I'm like, okay. And I see nobody else is doing it, getting it done. I immediately turn into this, da-da-da. It's something I try to avoid because I feel like I come off as mean. I probably shouldn't. So there's that. Last thing, what did I learn about race? For me, I think what I learned most, it was less about me, really. One of my biggest takeaways was it just made me think more about those talks that Dr. Christina Cleveland did. One of the biggest things that stuck out to me was that story of that black student. And I was like, It just made me think of, like, all the black people I know who were, like, in white environments all the time. So I was like, dang, that's interesting. I wonder what it looks like for them, what it looked like for them if they had gone through this to go through that, or what it would look like for them to go through that if they haven't already. How do you take what you learned into your racial identity journey? I think the biggest thing for me is it just gives me a better understanding, like Dr. Christina Cleveland's videos. It was helpful to get that information because I can now, like, be aware of where people are at, like try to find where people are at in their process, whatever skin color they are. How do you take what you learn into your, you read that. How do you see Jesus differently watching these videos? I don't really. I see him the same way as I've seen him. Yeah. And it's not a bad thing either. How would you apply what you learned at the local Young Life level with kids and leaders? I'm about to go over 10 minutes. How do I apply what I learned? I think first just being more aware. I think I can't remember. I don't remember who it was that was saying this. I think it was probably Dr. Christina Cleveland. But with her videos, it made me think of how I lead at East High School. There's kids of color, and there's also a bunch of white kids, and we can't disclude them. Like, we have majority of our club and D group is minority students. I had this encounter with this one kid one time, and he's a white student, and I was pretty sure I heard him say something racist. And I was there for like a week, I was trying to figure out if I heard what I thought I heard. I was kind of mad, but then at the same time, I was like, even with that, we can't disclude him or any other white student, specifically white students who may not be as aware of certain, social things. Kids who are kind of more racist is what I'm saying. So just, it's like, for bringing that into Young Life, that specific thing is just, it just helped me to realize that we still have to include all students, not just some, or the ones we prefer, or that we can relate to better. Where I learned from bringing in Reverend Dr. Soon, that, first, lament is something to look into. And right now, all I can say with that in relation to ministry at East is it may be helpful. I think it would be helpful possibly should probably have that be a part of the way we lead. So all I can really say is I have to look more into it. With Dr. Chris Dula, just, I think with that one, just understanding that we have to, I think, be prepared. Just be mindful of when a situation like that happens, where somebody is completely different based on what's going on. How do you read the Bible differently than before? I pay more attention. Since ELD started, I have begun to to focus a little more on what I'm reading. I used to have this tendency where I just read through stuff. Yep, I read it. I did my good thing. But now I really read and pay attention because I want to understand. One thing ELD has pushed me to do is to want to understand the Bible better. Because for me, my question after every weekend is, okay, how does the Bible play into all this? How does God play into this? What does His Word say? So it's pushed me to dig more. How do you approach God differently than before? I don't. I guess I do. Because I think a part of approaching God is approaching His Word. And since I'm digging more into His Word, really wanting to understand it, I guess that's the way I approach God differently, is I approach His words with more intentionally, with more intentionality. What questions do you still have? Shoot. I don't think I have any right now. I don't have any right now. Right now, as always, I'm just eager to read and understand. So yeah, I went a whole almost 5 minutes over. I talk a lot. Yeah. I'm gonna end it before it gets longer.